What started as an ordinary Tuesday afternoon turned into something that would leave an entire family questioning everything they thought they knew about their golden retriever. The security camera in the living room captured every second. And when the parents reviewed the footage later that evening, they sat in stunned silence, replaying it over and over again. This is that story. If you're ready to witness something absolutely incredible, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe because you won't want to miss what happens next. Sarah Mitchell had always considered herself a cautious parent. When her daughter Emma was born 8 months ago, she and her husband David had installed security cameras throughout their home in suburban Portland. Not because they didn't trust their golden retriever, Max, but because they wanted to capture every precious moment of their daughter's development. Max had been part of their family for 6 years, a gentle giant who had transitioned remarkably well when baby Emma arrived. On this particular afternoon, Sarah had put Emma down for her nap in the nursery upstairs before heading to the kitchen to prepare dinner. Max, as usual, had positioned himself at the bottom of the stairs, his unofficial post whenever the baby was sleeping. David was still at work, and the house was filled with that peaceful quiet that only comes when a baby is finally resting. Sarah was chopping vegetables when she heard it, the distinct sound of Emma's laughter echoing through the baby monitor. She glanced at the clock. Emma had only been down for 20 minutes, far too short for her usual 2-hour nap. With a slight sigh, Sarah wiped her hands on a towel and headed toward the stairs, expecting to find her daughter standing in her crib, ready to play. But when she reached the nursery, Sarah froze in the doorway. Emma wasn't in her crib. The side rail was still up. The blankets were still arranged exactly as Sarah had left them, but her daughter was gone. A wave of panic crashed over her as her eyes frantically scanned the room. Then she heard it again. Emma's giggling, but it was coming from downstairs. Heart pounding, Sarah rushed down the stairs, her mind racing through impossible scenarios. She burst into the living room and stopped dead in her tracks. There was Emma sitting perfectly upright on the plush rug in the center of the room, completely unharmed and laughing with pure joy. And beside her, looking remarkably pleased with himself, was Max. Sarah's legs felt weak as she tried to process what she was seeing. She had left Emma securely in her crib upstairs. The crib rail was still up. There was no way an 8-month-old baby could have climbed out on her own, navigated the hallway, and made it down a flight of 13 stairs without injury. It was impossible. Yet here Emma was, safe and happy, with Max sitting guard beside her. With trembling hands, Sarah scooped up her daughter, checking every inch of her for scratches, bumps, or any sign of distress. Emma simply giggled and reached for Max, clearly delighted by whatever adventure she'd just experienced. Max's tail wagged slowly, and he tilted his head in that characteristic way dogs do when they're waiting for approval. Before we continue our story, let's take just 5 seconds. If this story is touching your heart, please press the like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us because many more beautiful stories are coming. Thank you, my dear friend. Now, let us continue. When David came home that evening, Sarah recounted the incident, her voice still shaky with the residual fear and confusion. David's first reaction was to check the crib, searching for some logical explanation. Maybe the rail hadn't been properly locked, but no, everything was secure and functioning perfectly. They stood in the nursery, baffled and slightly unsettled. "We have to check the cameras," David said suddenly, pulling out his phone to access the security system. They had cameras in the nursery, the hallway, and the living room. Whatever had happened, it would be recorded. They settled on the couch with David's laptop, Emma playing contentedly in her play pen nearby, and Max lying at their feet. David pulled up the footage from the nursery, starting from when Sarah had put Emma down for her nap. They watched as Sarah gently placed Emma in the crib, adjusted her blanket, turned on the white noise machine, and quietly left the room. Emma fussed for a moment, then settled down. For the next 15 minutes, nothing unusual happened. Emma dozed, occasionally shifting position, but mostly sleeping peacefully. Then, at the 17-minute mark, something changed. Emma began to stir, making small sounds. They watched as she rolled over, pushed herself up, and grabbed the crib rail, attempting to pull herself to standing, something she'd been practicing but hadn't quite mastered yet. What happened next made both Sarah and David lean closer to the screen. Max appeared in the doorway of the nursery. They hadn't heard him come upstairs on the monitor, but there he was, moving with deliberate purpose into the room. He approached the crib and stood on his hind legs, his front paws resting on the rail as he looked down at Emma. "What is he doing?" Sarah whispered. Even though they were watching recorded footage, they watched, barely breathing, as Max carefully assessed the situation. Emma was now fully awake and beginning to get fussy, working herself up to a cry. Max looked toward the door, then back at Emma, as if making a decision. Then, in a movement that seemed both calculated and gentle, he lowered himself back to all fours and positioned himself next to the crib. What came next seemed impossible. Max carefully gripped the edge of Emma's onesie with his teeth, so gently that the fabric barely wrinkled. Emma, instead of being frightened, seemed to understand that something important was happening. Her fussing stopped, and she looked down at Max with wide, curious eyes. With extraordinary care, Max began to lift. The fabric of the onesie was strong, designed for babies who are constantly being picked up and moved, and it held as Max slowly raised Emma over the crib rail. The whole process took nearly a minute, with Max making constant micro-adjustments to keep Emma level and secure. Once Emma was clear of the rail, Max gently lowered her until her feet touched the floor of the nursery. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, her hand covering her mouth. But Max wasn't done. As they switched to the hallway camera, they watched as Max positioned himself directly in front of Emma, who was now sitting on the floor, looking slightly surprised by this turn of events. Max then lowered his body completely flat against the floor and began to slowly scoot backward toward the hallway, maintaining constant eye contact with Emma. Understanding seemed to dawn on Emma's face. She reached forward and grabbed handfuls of Max's golden fur. The dog moved with such careful deliberation, backing up inch by inch, allowing Emma to hold on as she was essentially dragged in a sitting position out of the nursery and into the hallway. David paused the video. "Are we really seeing this?" They watched as Max navigated the hallway, Emma still gripping his fur, both of them moving toward the staircase. When they reached the top of the stairs, Sarah grabbed David's arm. This was the part that terrified her most. 13 stairs stood between Emma and the living room. Max paused at the top of the stairs, and they could see him turn his head to look down, then back at Emma. What happened next demonstrated an intelligence and problem-solving ability that neither Sarah nor David had imagined possible in their beloved pet. Max repositioned himself so that he was sideways on the landing, his body forming a barrier between Emma and the stairs. Then, keeping his body low, he allowed Emma to maintain her grip on his fur as he slowly descended the first stair backward. His body remained angled to create a buffer, and he moved with such control that Emma barely shifted position. Stair by stair, Max descended. At one point, around the 7th stair, Emma's grip loosened, and both Sarah and David gasped despite knowing the outcome. But Max immediately stopped, adjusted his position, waited for Emma to re-establish her hold, and only then continued downward. When they finally reached the bottom, the living room camera picked up the rest. Max guided Emma to the center of the rug, the softest spot in the room. And only then did he fully relax, lying down beside her. Emma, seemingly thrilled by the adventure, had begun to laugh, which is exactly when Sarah had heard her through the monitor. The footage ended with Sarah entering the room moments later. They sat in silence for a long moment, the laptop screen now dark. Emma had fallen asleep in her playpen, and Max hadn't moved from his spot on the floor, watching over her as he always did. How did he know to do that? Sarah asked, her voice filled with wonder. David shook his head slowly. I have no idea. But he understood that she was awake. He knew she wanted to come downstairs. And somehow he figured out how to make it happen safely. Over the next few days, Sarah and David couldn't stop thinking about what they'd witnessed. They showed the footage to their pediatrician, who was equally amazed, noting that Emma showed no signs of stress or fear during the entire event. They consulted with a dog behaviorist who explained that dogs, particularly those with strong bonds to their families, can demonstrate remarkable problem-solving abilities and caretaking instincts. But even she admitted this was extraordinary. What struck them most wasn't just the physical feat of what Max had accomplished, but the obvious planning and care involved in every step. He had assessed the problem, formulated a solution, and executed it with constant attention to Emma's safety and comfort. The gentle grip on the onesie, the slow and steady descent of the stairs, the positioning of his body as a constant barrier. Every action spoke to an understanding that went beyond simple animal instinct. They made the decision not to post the video publicly, wanting to protect Emma's privacy, but they did share it with close family and friends. The reactions were universally the same. Disbelief followed by amazement followed by tears. Max, for his part, seemed to understand that he'd done something special. He carried himself with a quiet pride, though his devotion to Emma never wavered. Sarah and David did make one change after that day. They installed a more sophisticated baby monitor with motion alerts and lowered Emma's crib mattress to its lowest setting. But they also made peace with the fact that they shared their home with a dog who had demonstrated an almost supernatural level of care for their daughter. As Emma grew, the bond between her and Max only deepened. Her first word, much to Sarah's mock dismay, was "Ma," but she was looking at Max when she said it. The dog remained her constant companion, her protector, and apparently, when needed, her personal transportation service. That Tuesday afternoon became a defining moment for the Mitchell family. It taught them that intelligence and love can manifest in the most unexpected ways, and that sometimes the family members we underestimate the most are capable of the most extraordinary acts of devotion. Max had taken it upon himself to solve a problem and care for a vulnerable member of his pack. And he'd done it with a grace and intelligence that challenged everything they thought they knew about the animals we share our lives with. The camera had captured every moment, providing indisputable proof of something that would have otherwise seemed like an impossible story. And while Sarah and David had installed those cameras to catch precious memories of their daughter's milestones, they'd ended up documenting something far more profound. A demonstration of unconditional love and protection that transcended species. A reminder that family comes in all forms, and that sometimes our four-legged companions understand more than we could ever imagine. If this incredible story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And let us know in the comments, have you ever witnessed your pet do something absolutely extraordinary? We'd love to hear your stories. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the most unbelievable moments are the ones that are completely true.